Mr. Administrator, thanks for being here. And I'm going to drill down a little more. I'm going to go back to Senator Capito's concerns about the proposed rule. And not only the lack of authority, I believe there's a lack of authority to do it, but also on the practicality of it. But first on the authority side, why? Before I get to why it's not going to work in North Dakota or other places that aren't going to require commuter buses or subways. In the Inflation Reduction Act, it dedicated $27 billion for a green bank, something that the EPA withdrew almost immediately after getting the authority to do it, and they created instead of this sort of slush fund for grants. Now, there's nothing new in the law that expressly prohibits such a thing, and this is this has been the tradition of decades of administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, to take the absence of a prohibition in a law that authorizes certain things as a license to do whatever's not prohibited. But I want to speak to two really big recent Supreme Court cases that, using the major questions doctrine, stating emphatically that agencies don't have authority that isn't given them in law. And that, of course, the first one being West Virginia versus EPA, and then the other one being the WOTUS rule. Now they're going to take up maybe a Chevron doctrine issue, and we'll see how that turns out. So I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the bureaucracy is not a fourth branch of government that are policymakers. First of all, so I want to ask you, what's your sense of the actual authority to do these things? But secondly, I want to stress that it's impractical in places, rural places especially. We just aren't going to build subways in North Dakota to get people to their farm. And so I would hope if this is going to proceed, I'd rather have you withdraw like you wisely did with the previous memorandum. But short of that, I hope there's consideration for the uniqueness or this, the different qualities of different places across our very diverse country.
Senator, I thank you for that question and statement. And I guess I would frame this, you had sort of a two-part
right.
piece there. So on the legal authority, I'm not a lawyer, but I start virtually all of my meetings within federal highways is we will follow the law. And we have lawyers on staff, and I take that very seriously. And so I don't want to opine as a lawyer. I will follow the direction that our lawyers give us on following the law very clearly. I hear you on the impacts, particularly for rural states and others around this piece, and not likely to build a subway around Devil's Lake. But I would simply say here on this piece that this bipartisan infrastructure law did have a climate change title in it, and from a performance management perspective, right? Like when I was in Delaware, it was hard to get folks to talk about performance management, bridge condition, pavement conditions. I think what we're trying to look at here is not sort of penalize states for their greenhouse gas emissions, but just get them to begin tracking greenhouse gas emissions as if 30% of our GHG is coming from the transportation sector, this is the piece of it. And maybe it's not a subway, but maybe it's alternative fuels, like other things, electric vehicles, other ways to drive that down. So I know it's become a very political hot button issue here, but as with most of my efforts, I try to just focus on here's what we're trying to get to, and we'll follow the law, but not to be punitive, but more from a tracking perspective.
And I appreciate that, but I also, on this particular topic, for example, while there's a title that relates to the basic issue, we discussed this specific issue and decided not to do it. In other words, there's not a lot of ambiguity about the intent of the Congress in this legislation. So again, your lawyers will duke that out, or they'll find some way around it, and eventually we'll, But here's short of the Supreme Court weighing in specifically on a lawsuit on a rule that's so far not a rule, so I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But I think we have to consider that if we're going to be this sort of general with our authorities at the administrative level, the next administration might be of a different persuasion and take that slush fund at the EPA and say, hey, let's build a wall with solar panels at the southern border. And, you know, I mean, just, it seems extreme, and it probably is, but there's a lot less extreme examples that I could probably come up with that I think, you know, Democrats would find objectionable for good reason. So with that, I appreciate hanging in there with the law. I always dismiss the lawyers after I get their advice before I make big decisions. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.